Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 73. And today's episode is going to be a little bit different because we're going to be talking about the mind and body. Don't worry, it'll still be tied into software development. And here today to join me to talk about this is Rob West. And I actually work with Rob, so I can definitely vouch for his knowledge in the area. So welcome to the show, Rob.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind words.
Oh, you're most welcome. I've actually been really looking forward to this conversation because, as you know, I'm quite interested in this stuff as well. And in our past conversations, we chatted a lot about this kind of thing. So it'll be awesome to actually make a podcast out of it.
Yeah. And so just a little bit for the listeners in terms of my background. So I've been a software engineering manager for 15 years now. And I'm also a qualified coach. I'm accredited by the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, and I run a business, a Double Loop Coaching, as a coaching business. And I'm really interested in the application of psychology and neuroscience to what we do in our profession and to help people to get to better performance. So I think we're going to be covering some of those areas in what we do today.
I think just the mix between, because you've obviously with your software development background, I've got like a strong technical background, but then looking at this, the coaching side of things, just putting them together. And it's stuff like, obviously we work together, so I see you applying this a lot as a manager. And I think this, just make a really great conversation. But before we start digging into this, just a few reminders to the listeners. Firstly, this podcast has its own Discord community. If you head over to the website unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see a big Discord link there. I also have a monthly newsletter where I send out hand-picked developer news items of the past month. It also includes a dev tip and a dev comic pick, as well as updates about the podcast. So if you want to sign up, there's a subscribe link on the podcast website. And lastly, a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. So I don't know whether we'll change the title of this show in between now and publishing, but I do really like it. At the moment, it's Upgrade Your Brain's OS, which I think is a really nice metaphor. Similarly, I don't know, I always get those two confused about our conversation today. Because like we're programmers and we obviously spend a lot of time optimizing and thinking about how our code and software works and hopefully trying to improve it. But I guess a lot of people don't do the same for their own computational hardware, like the brain. So I guess given this is a software development podcast, just to avoid the listeners getting totally confused, can we start by framing the conversation into what we're going to talk about today, but also how that applies to our role as software developers?
Yeah, so as you said, I mean, we're all really keen, people listening to your podcast love gaining knowledge, love getting new skills, but people don't really think about the sort of underlying capacities that they have for things like attention and flow state and actually being able to focus on their work. And it's those underlying capacities that actually, if you think about it, they have a huge impact in terms of your productivity and your ability to do work and to learn. So the capacities that you've got around your attentional capacity, your capabilities, and I think people might really kind of sort of chime in with that when you think about, flow state. So if we talk about that sense that, this sort of time disappears, you really focus on coding something and you just feel like you're in the moment and in the flow of it. And I think many of the listeners will have had kind of moments like that. And really the thing for me is, well, what if you could get even 10% more of that in your working day? Imagine the impact that would have. And the message I want to have for people is actually that is hugely trainable. And actually the flip side, a lot of what we do in our day-to-day and the way we organize ourselves and our digital environments actually kind of impacts and actually degrades that ability to get into that flow state. And so I kind of think of that kind of capacity as like the brain's operating system. So learning a new skill is great. That's like adding some new software. But if you can really improve the operating system that stuff runs on, that's a real game changer in terms of how effective you are and how much you enjoy your work. And that's one of the ways that I got into this, because I'm quite interested in positive psychology, which is, normal psychology is normally about sort of problems like depression or anxiety or something like that. The positive psychology movement is, well, actually, if you don't have any of those and you're just like in quotes, normal, how do you enhance that? How do you live better? How do you be more effective? How do you get more happiness and enjoyment? And actually, if you look at the kind of theories around that in positive psychology, well, one of the ways that we really enjoy ourselves is when we're exercising a strength. And when you're in that flow state is kind of one of the ways that you can recognize when you're exercising a strength. So that flow capacity, I think, is something that we all enjoy as developers, but it's actually a key part of actually, happiness, enjoyment, and fulfillment in your job.
Yeah, I definitely, if I think back to days where I've felt more productive or days I've got to the end and thought, well, I've got nothing done. As you say, like a key factor is focus. It's like how focused I've been. As you know, I'm quite interested in trying to find little productivity tips, like even like learning the ID and finding keyboard shortcuts. But much more than that is this aspect of focus, which makes a big difference. It's like I can learn all the keyboard shortcuts I want in the world, but if I'm distracted, then I'll get to the end of the day and I just don't feel satisfied that I've actually been productive, as you're saying. And I just find it really interesting what you were saying, that's highly trainable, almost like a muscle, I guess.
Yeah.
Are there some like good techniques you would use, well, good exercises, I guess, mental exercises to train that muscle?
Well, absolutely. And kind of spoiler alert, I think mindfulness and mindful meditation are really good ways to do that, for sure.
Yeah, that's something in our past conversations, we've spoken quite a few times about that. And it's definitely something that I need to try and find time to do, because I'm just with all the things I do, so busy. But yeah, I think last week we were chatting about it, and you were saying literally just 10 minutes a day of doing it. So I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to set a personal challenge to try and find that 10 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, the brain is just a wonderful organ, right? We know that we can learn, and learning changes the brain structure. I think most people would find that unsurprising, but actually, there's the term for it is neuroplasticity. And your brain has a huge capacity to change, to grow, and you can actually have a really big impact. That's why I call it the brain's operating system. You can do things, and that will have an actual impact that you can see in a brain scanner in terms of the changes in the ways that parts of your brain are connected.
Is that the same regardless of what age you are?
Yep. So, I mean, obviously, part of sort of development as an infant and a child, there's a huge amount of brain development. I mean, you're actually born with twice as many brain cells as you end up with, and actually part of early life is a lot of those getting kind of pruned off.
I didn't know that.
Which is it's amazing in terms of how brains actually form. That just shows you how important your early experience is, because it's determining like which neurons live and which die.
I must feel like a newborn baby should be a genius then. I didn't even know that. That was quite interesting.
I think it would be useful to kind of look into the background of it, but absolutely, I think the positive message that I see coming out of neuroscience and psychology is quite how open we are to change. So we can think our ways of thinking and behavior and our capacities are kind of baked in, but they're really not. There are some aspects, I mean, it is very hard to change some things for sure, but you can. But actually, with some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in terms of mindfulness, you can see changes in brain structures in a very short time, in a couple of months. And if you think that, you can have an exercise that you can do for 10 minutes a day, but actually you'll see a physical change in the brain in a couple of months. That's just mind-blowing to me about like how much our brains are able to change.
I'll never forget talking about mindfulness and meditation. For listeners, Rob did a lightning talk. Was it early this year?
I think it was last year. Yeah.
Last year. And basically had a room full of developers with their eyes closed, meditating. And that was just so good to see.
Well, should we get into some of the stuff behind that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Because I think that might be useful for people. So, I mean, we're talking about, and this area is flow and focus, as you say. And in psychology, that's really kind of what would be thought of as attention, and the attention and the psychology of attention. And there's a few basic bits of that. I think it's really helpful if you start to understand those. You can kind of see, this is what's going on for me. So two aspects, sort of basic aspects of attention. You've got this kind of, I would call them like floodlight and flashlight as different types of attention. So you've got this, your brain's got this kind of sort of alerting floodlight, sort of diffuse attention to all the information that's kind of out there in your kind of sensory sphere. And then you've got the flashlight. So the floodlight is there to sort of kind of monitor the environment for things that are going on. And the flashlight is, there's something here that needs us to sort of process it a bit more. And you've got that going on. And then you've got this thing which is called executive attention, but I'll just call it the controller because it kind of fits in with kind of the ways that we might think as .NET developers. And the controller is there to kind of manage where you are in terms of like the flashlight of that attention and what's going on in the background. And you can kind of see a couple of aspects of that just really easy. So, imagine you're in a pub talking to people and there's a TV off in the periphery of your vision. Now, what will typically happen in that situation, no matter how interesting the conversation is that you're in, your eye is going to constantly get drawn back to what's going on that TV. And that's an interplay there between the floodlight, the flashlight, and the controller. So you're trying to focus on what somebody's sort of saying to you and them and their facial expressions. That's where you want your attention to be. But your brain's kind of floodlight, there's something going on there that it can't predict, or is an unpredictable part of the environment. And it's constantly drawing you. It's saying, hey, here, there's something that we need to worry about and investigate further. And it's dragging that flashlight over to that thing. So that's just one way that you can start to see that, we've got these attentional capacities, but they can kind of be hijacked by things in our environment, which is super interesting where you think about, what we do in terms of our digital environments, where there's all sorts of things going on around the screen all of the time. And it's entirely understandable if you think about it from a kind of evolutionary point of view, that your brain's job is to keep you alive. So if there's something going on, it's going to say, oh, focus, needs to go to that thing to check if it's going to be good or bad for us.
That sounds like it's almost, rather than just training like, oh, I've got an email, I'm going to ignore it and carry on working. It's more about close your email client so you don't even get that distraction in the first place.
Absolutely. So just understanding that we are kind of wired for distraction just means you can kind of have a bit of an environmental detox and actually close some stuff down so that, if you want to get into that flow state, well, why not do that? Why not have that time blocking where you say, I'm going to be on, for the next hour, I'm going to turn all of that stuff off and just have my IDE open. And there's going to be none of that stuff to kind of drag the attention. And we might talk a little bit later about some of the other costs of that. But just understanding those attentional mechanisms can be like really useful to say, oh, okay, I get what's happening here. And if I've got those things, it's constantly going to be dragging me away from what I'm focusing on.
I'm glad this webcam isn't showing the messiness of my environment over there. Luckily, my environment isn't popping up. It's a mess, but it's not popping up notifications. That's quite good. But I guess even probably I'm sat here with 3 monitors now. And if I really wanted to focus, I guess even just something as simple as turning off the other monitors, except for my main IDE. Yeah, it's quite interesting. And it's kind of like, I'm all flooded because I've just so many windows open and everything. And I think I just do need to just close everything down. I do, like we we're talking about before about the days where I noticed that I'm more productive than others. One thing, like if I do put Microsoft Teams onto Do Not Disturb mode, that is a massive difference. And I need to make sure I do that more often. But then it's kind of, I guess on the flip side, and you mentioned before about, we can talk about the flip side of like the negatives of doing that. But if I've got a colleague that I need to ping and get some information from, if they've got Do Not Disturb mode on and it's 2 hours later when I get a reply, then that might be blocking me. So I suppose it's kind of like a balance, whether you do turn everything off or pros and cons, I guess.
Yeah, and this is one of the challenges in terms of remote teams. And it's something that's so tricky to work out. And that we try and kind of work on it a lot. But that balance between getting that focus time so that everybody can be really productive, but then needing to collaborate and get information from each other. I need a PR review or whatever it is. But I think there is an element of like effective working is kind of planning ahead. So that this is my view. It's kind of your responsibility to kind of manage those points of collaboration and not just expect people to be immediately available for you. So then you can kind of contract with people that, I'm likely to get this. Is there a suitable point where we can have a conversation and plan ahead, rather than what can happen is you just tend to kind of crack on with your work and say, all right, I'm done. Ace. Right now I need somebody to come and unblock me and kind of be interruptive about it. So it's just understanding that there's a constant need to sort of plan that collaboration, because, collaboration is not always a good thing. Not too much collaboration will actually impact on the overall productivity of the team.
Yeah, I guess if that's totally stopping you from getting in the zone or the flow state that you were describing before. Like one thing I do a lot, and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on it, is the Pomodoro technique, where you've got a fixed time for like 25 minutes, and then you get a bit of a break. And that break could, if you extend that break to 10 minutes, that could include replying to messages, then have your break away from the computer. Is that something that you would advocate?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a great fan of Cal Newport's work. So he's written a few books like Deep Work, and he's got one on slow productivity that's just come out. He has this idea of like office hours. So I guess there's 2 ideas that he has, like time blocking and office hours. So time blocking is where you say, right, I'm going to focus on my development work for a period, and I'm going to have a period where I'm going to do my other things, where it's email or catch up on other messages or what have you. So just being intentional about how you divide up your time. But he has this concept of, having office hours. Say, I will be available for other people to come and talk to me at like 2:00 every day or whatever it is. But just kind of having those kind of points, and then everybody can understand how each other works and when those are going to be. And then you can kind of plan for that. As you say, you can get, a solid piece of work done when might be suitable for you if you're a morning person or an evening person or whatever. But then you can kind of have a little break and a little change of context and kind of get those things done, and then come back to kind of get into that focus again.
It might have even been you that shared the episode, but I listened to a podcast episode with Cal Newboss in it, and it was talking about this office hours. So I've got a feeling it was you that shared in Teams the link. And yeah, just I like that idea where it's kind of like anyone can join, and it's almost like just like a community session. It's like come and ask me anything, and then this is it's scheduled time. So and then everyone knows that, so they know how you work, and out of that time you're focused, so you might not reply straight away. But yeah, I'll make sure I include that episode, but also his Deep Work book, which is one of these books which kind of, there's a set of productivity books which just seem to like become viral and are very well known, and this obviously is one of them. But I'll make sure I include that in the show notes. Yeah,
I mean, his latest one, he talks about like pseudo productivity, and we have this in lots of businesses where, being in lots of meetings or being very visible and is something that's kind of, that person must be really effective. But actually, when you think about it, it's really not. And we do lots of things to fill our days, but is it actually getting the job done? I really like his stuff because he gets you to think about, well, what actually does matter and how can you organize your work to actually get the stuff that really does matter done.
Does it work having like maybe each day, even though you've got multiple things to do, just picking one which is your main focus, and then everything else is kind of like an extra thing, but your mental focus is on that one thing and getting that done or progressing with that one thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that speaks to that kind of flow state piece again. If you know that your sole focus for that day is one thing, you're just much more likely to be able to get into that flow state and focus on it, because you're setting aside all of those other things. You just don't have to worry about them today. You can just focus.
There was one technique I read about, I can't remember where I heard about it from. It's JOT, just one thing. And the idea is that this applies to work or like not work. It might be around the house if you've got a few things to do. But you get a piece of paper, or if it's digital, Obsidian page or OneNote page, whatever it is, and it's blank at the start of the day or the session, and you write down just one thing. You can't write down anything more. It's not a to-do list. You write down the one thing you're focusing on. You focus on that till it's done. And this doesn't have to be a whole user story. It's just one tiny, granular thing. Once that's done, you can cross it out. And then you write the next thing. And you can't do anything else. You can't write down any extra to-dos on that list. It's just that one thing. Once that's done, you cross it out. I really like that because it kind of forces that focus on just one thing. And yeah, as you know, like with research and stuff, they've proved many times that humans can't multitask. It's just task switching. And yeah, I think once we accept that makes a big difference.
And then one of the things that I think people like about that is like if you write a big long to-do list, it can feel quite overwhelming. So actually just having that one thing, it kind of allows you almost to focus on it. And then you get that when you can kind of tick it off. That's a really effective way for you to kind of close that down in your brain and kind of free up resources. There's nothing kind of lingering in your frontal lobes that's kind of still on that task.
So does that tie in with, like, when you said ticking it off, I was thinking about like dopamine and dopamine hits and stuff. Is that something that's worth covering? As in, I know that like nowadays, like I think about this with my kids, where they're on the Switch. My eldest has started like trying to go on YouTube. I try and limit it, but when he goes on YouTube Shorts or something and he's flicking through, so it's very quick, very short-lived things to get a reward. And I feel that's just long-term going to affect his focus because he's just so used to quick wins rather than, you were mentioning about Cal Newport before about his deep work, rather than actually being able to focus deeply for a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, this is one aspect of those systems. And Andrew Huberman talks about this. It's really dangerous with things like YouTube that you can get, or we have information available at our fingertips, and being able to get an outcome with very little effort is kind of giving your brain really bad lessons in life, because most of the things that we actually really do want do require sustained effort. And all of that thing, maybe we'll kind of get into some of that, is actually harming your brain's ability to have that sustained effort. So those constant kind of short hits, you just don't learn that actually that machinery, it takes a little bit of time to kind of warm up in your brain, and you have to kind of push through. and kind of get into it, so part of actually kind of getting into the zone with something like learning or reading or kind of actually getting into solving a problem, the systems take a while to really get their juices flowing. If you're not used to that, then you can go, this is too hard, and kind of give up before you've really kind of got into your stride. So it's, I think there is an element of learning that actually sustained effort, is a skill. And maybe we'll get into some of the stuff that sits behind that in terms of your brain structures and what's going on. But it is totally a capacity that you can either grow in some way through sort of sustained effort, or you can diminish by just constantly getting short hits.
So is that almost like with exercise, if you're running and there's that concept of a pain barrier, maybe not pain, but there's a point where you push through and then it becomes easier? Is that a similar kind of concept?
It's something like that actually is sort of, your brain systems will take a while to get home. So it's sort of like, when you go out for a run and the first 10, 15 minutes it's going to feel pretty ropey. But then it's, you start to improve, and by the end you're probably thinking, well, this is pretty good. It's exactly the same with your brain.
Cool. So going back to, we were talking about meditation and mindfulness, and I did mention that we've spoken about 10 minutes a day, and I'll set that as a personal challenge. So from today, in fact, I'm going to trial this 10 minutes a day doing this. If I find a bit of quiet space, what should I be doing during that? Just so that if the listeners want to do the same, well, what does that look like?
Well, I mean, if it's okay, let me just step back a little bit and talk about a couple of other bits of the puzzle, and then I'll answer the question. So we've already talked a little bit about some of the sort of attentional mechanisms and that controller. One of the things that controller actually also does is kind of manage a couple of important sort of areas or networks that we've got. And this was actually something that was discovered through brain imaging studies, where they put people in a brain scanner. They'd get them to do a task, and in order to kind of get those pictures, which listeners may have seen of like slices of brain with kind of colours on them to show which bits are active, they'd do the task, and then they need to kind of almost sort of cancel out from that task a kind of a default state of the brain. So what they would do is you do a period of the task, and they'd capture the brain activity for that, and then the subjects in the brain's going to be asked to sort of just rest between. And the assumption was that the brain would just sort of go into an idle state. And they called this the kind of default mode. But what they actually realized is, rather than just sort of shutting down and being idle, there's actually other networks that kind of switch on in that kind of period where there's no external task. And that network was, it's called the default mode network. But really what we've discovered since then is that network's involved in kind of daydreaming, mind wandering, sort of self-referential thinking, and it's doing all sorts of planning, thinking about stuff that's happened, stuff that's going to be. It's almost like a little virtual reality world in itself, which is really interesting. But what they've discovered is that actually that control system for your attention is sort of managing the balance between that sort of task positive networks that are actually kind of when your attention is focused and you're trying to get something done, a cognitive task or something in your in the external world. And when that's active, that controller is kind of dialing down that default mode and that kind of self-referential sort of simulation network. And the flip side, when there's no sort of external task happening, that default mode network will kind of come online and start to work. And actually, mindfulness, I think if you know about those things, it's really interesting to see how they interact. So mindfulness is kind of basically defined as awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. So really it's just about really having that, the spotlight of attention focused on something in the now. But what's really interesting is that, the research indicates that more than 50% of our days are spent in that default mode network. So where our focus isn't on the task at hand or something that we're doing, we're thinking about, where we're going to go on holiday, or that meeting that we just had and what that person said, or, something that I've got coming up, at the weekend or what have you. And mindfulness is about, and in mindfulness, that would be called like either autopilot or trance state. So it's this idea that actually we don't spend a lot of our time actually focused on what we're doing. And that default mode network, sometimes it's kind of driving us almost to the point where it's not actually helpful for us and is getting in the way of things. So you can think of mindfulness as about learning to control those different brain systems. And mindful meditation, it was originally designed as sort of a practice to help you stay in that now and sort of not get distracted by other things. But you can actually think of it as an attentional practice or a practice that's going to build your capacity for attention. And it's really simple. You choose something that is a focus for your attention. So typically that might be something like the breath or some sensations in your body, but it could be sounds or even thoughts. So you've got that flashlight of attention and you're focusing on a simple task to just follow the sensations of the breath. And of course, what's going to happen when you do that, you're going to get distracted. You're going to be thinking about all of those things. The default mode network's going to come online and you're going to, what am I going to have for lunch? And all of those kind of thoughts. And then you have this aha moment. Oh, hang on. I was supposed to be focusing on the breath. And you bring your attention back to the breath. And the point in mindful meditation that, when your mind wanders, that's not wrong. That's just what minds do. But it's just building up that capacity to gently bring the attention back to the thing that you're focusing on. And if you think about what I've just been talking about in terms of those attentional systems, you're getting that flashlight of attention. You're giving it a task to do, just something simple to follow the breath. So you've got those task positive networks engaged on that, and your focus is on that. You've got the default mode network, which is kicking in, and then you've got that controller, which is responsible for noticing what's going on and the balance of where your attention should be, and it's redirecting that back. And what's happening in the brain is basically doing that again and again for a period of 10, 15 minutes a day helps to get those networks to work more effectively together. You're building that capacity for that controller to build awareness and be able to keep you on task. And that's the secret sauce of why mindfulness and meditation practice can be so good for you in terms of your ability to get in flow state, because it is like working the muscle of attention so that you're recognizing when you are distracted and bringing your focus back.
Going back to what you were saying before, were you saying that that's shown noticeable difference in brain scans as well? That's very powerful.
It totally is, and the way that neuroscience is going, it's understanding that it's not like discrete little sort of lumps of your brain that are responsible for things. It's kind of wider networks within the brain, and the way that those networks kind of interact with each other. And you can see structural changes in just 8 weeks of mindful practice from start to finish, which, that's amazing that you can see that much change in a human brain in that period of time.
I feel like before I take on this personal challenge, I need a brain scan to get a starting point.
But you can see how, from what I was talking about earlier, that kind of floodlight, we are totally wired to be distracted by stuff. So it's inevitable, right? But building that mindful practice just allows you to sort of build that muscle of return to the item that I'm focusing on, so that you can more and more sort of stay in that kind of focus state and attending to the thing that you actually want to attend to.
And I guess like taking it the other direction as well, where we're talking here about the floodlight and being able to control that and doing more of the spotlight so you can actually focus on something. Sometimes if you can't solve a problem, does that explain why if you just go away from your desk and go for a walk, it becomes more creative and you're moving from the focus to the wider floodlight, that sometimes like extra creativity can, it was that. Or sometimes if you go to the toilet, it's like, how many problems have you solved when you've gone to the loo? That kind of thing, just getting away from that focus.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't want people to go away with the idea that default mode network and that ability to simulate and imagine is bad. It can be if we sort of go over the same things again and again and we just ruminate on something. We kind of go round and round in circles and don't get anywhere. But actually, part of what your brain's trying to do in that is to solve problems. And I like the phrase kind of cognitive white space. And I don't think people give themselves enough of that in the day. So as you say, it's like Pomodoro can be quite good periods of focus, and then giving where you're kind of, that controller in your brain is kind of suppressing the default mode and you're really focused on that task. But actually giving yourself space. That's one of the ways that I think having devices constantly available to us is actually detrimental to performance, because you see it. We're never a dull moment. If there's something not going on, we'll reach for our phones to kind of distract us and give us something to think about. And actually, there's a lot of power in just letting the mind wander and just a little bit of boredom and let the brain quieten down and actually sort of work on solving a problem. And like you say, if you think, the listeners think about this, when do you get great ideas? When it's taking the dog for a walk or in the shower or doing some of those other things where there's nothing else to focus on, and those systems can actually kind of get to work productively for us.
I find it quite interesting sometimes, just intentionally letting my mind wander, but as in almost like the opposite of what you were saying before, where if your mind wanders, pulling it back to focus, but not allowing myself to focus on anything, and also not allowing myself to change what my thought is. So basically just remove conscious decision about where my thought process is going and see where the subconscious thought, what I'm thinking about just changes naturally, and just see what happens. I guess that is a form of meditation, but probably a different form, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So I definitely would say one of the aspects of mindfulness is not forcing things. If you try not to think about something, what's going to happen? You're going to create resistance in yourself, and you almost create more tension and make it more likely that you are. The point of a mindfulness practice is actually to, those thoughts come, you have this kind of metaphor of the cloud, the sort of the blue sky being the mind and the clouds being the thoughts. And you kind of learn the capacity that these thoughts are going to come and go, but they're just like clouds. They're going to pass across the sky and fade. And actually a lot of what we do sometimes is kind of sort of hang on to them, and kind of we almost sort of feed cycles of those thoughts and cause them to hang around longer. Whereas actually if we just give up on controlling thoughts and just let them happen, it creates a bit more space in the mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it ties in, so we were speaking about famous books before, quite an old book now is Dave Allen's Getting Things Done book, where one of the main things about it is if something comes into your mind, get it into a system out of your brain, so you've not got all these things floating around, which is stopping you from focusing and also causing stress. Like sometimes if you wake up in the middle of the night and you've not written something down, and then you start ruminating over it and worrying about it and all of these things. So I do try and, as you know, I kind of probably rely on technology too much, but I do try and if I'm on a walk or something and I think of something like is to do or an idea or something, I just throw it into my phone. I've got my to-do list I use has got an inbox, which I keep empty, but it's kind of, that's the landing place. I'll put it in there. I don't have to worry about due date or priority or even wording it nicely, as long as later on that day when I empty my to-do list inbox, as long as at that point I understand what I meant, so there's enough information, then I can categorize it and tag it and everything. And I think just getting all of that stuff out of my head as when it comes in just means that my brain's free to focus, but also to be, if I'm thinking about something, it's new stuff and it's just planning stuff or ideas or creativity stuff, rather than dwelling on things that I'm trying to hold in my head, which I just don't need to, because I could have just written them down and it might be something that's not important or something that I don't need to think about until next week or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good mechanism for kind of, as you say, almost getting that stuff out of working memory. It's down on a piece of paper or something electronic. And then, the thoughts come, thoughts gone, and there's no stress. There's no mental effort in kind of maintaining it somewhere.
One thing that I just seen in my own notes that I found quite interesting, I can't remember where, it was a few months ago on a podcast I heard, was we were talking about just focusing on one thing before. Apparently the meaning of the word priority, it's a Latin word for prioritas, which means first thing, and it's singular. So the term priorities, plural, actually makes no sense, because that suggests multiple things, but the actual term means a singular focus. And I thought that was just quite interesting. It's kind of have one priority and focus on it. But
Yeah, definitely. It was originally meant one thing, and think about modern work these days. You usually have, I don't know, 5-10 priorities, which is always what I think is one of the tenets of lean kind of thinking, is limit work in progress. And if you can get to just one thing, I think you're doing well.
Yeah, I guess when you're in a business where you've got multiple people saying what your top priority should be, then there's going to be, you just need to decide and learn to say no, I guess. But I suppose that's easier said than done in some environments. Another thing we're going to talk about is, I suppose, the fundamentals. Is there now a good time, or is there anything we want to talk about in the areas we've just done?
I wouldn't mind just having kind of going back to what you were saying about task switching. There's a really interesting thing in there that I think people, it will be helpful to them. And as you were saying, that those sort of task positive networks in our brain, they're serial, they can't work in parallel. So there's no such thing as multitasking, there's just task switching. And we sort of know this in software development. We talk about kind of the cost of context switching, but actually it's worse than you think. And there's a simple little thing, I use this in that lightning talk that I did, that you can use to demonstrate the cost of switching tasks. So if you take the phrase, Mary had a little lamb, its fleece as white as snow. And if, the listeners just say that in their head and kind of count, if we leave them space for that, it's probably going to take about that length, maybe 3-4 seconds. And there's 11 words in that sentence. So again, if you just the listeners in their head, just count from 1 to 11, and we'll give some space for that. And again, it's probably going to take a few seconds. Now, if I get you to say a word and then a number, so Mary 1 had 2, and if, no stress, Dan, but if you...
no, you're not testing me.
But again, if we just give a little moment for listeners to try and do that, and maybe if you want to see how long it takes you, if I, say go.
Oh, okay. Mary 1 had 2, A 3, little 4, lamb 5, it's 6, fleece 7, was 8, white 9.
Yeah, I think you've ably demonstrated. It's much harder, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that is because, in switching between those two tasks, there's something. So you've got two tasks going on there and you're trying to switch backward and forward. And there's something called inhibition of return. So it's part of the brain's attentional system. It comes from kind of the perceptual field and when you're searching for something. So your brain's got this mechanism which will, once you've searched an area of your visual field, your brain will kind of suppress that and make it hard to go back so that you kind of search around for new possibilities. But actually this is something that kind of affects, neuroscientists now think affects a lot of the kind of processing that we do. You can see why it would be good, right? Because, it does encourage novelty, because you're moving away from things. So, but it means that going back to a thing is hard, because your brain's actually inhibiting that. So you actually have to force yourself to kind of go back to a task that you were doing. So not only is context switching kind of got a cost, it's actually got a mental effort to it. So we're actually fighting our neural machinery when we're constantly switching tasks. And I think this is one of the reasons why sometimes you get to the end of the day and you're mentally exhausted, because you're kind of having to put your brain through that kind of inhibition of return, the effort to overcome that all of the time. If you think about the way that sometimes we work, which is bouncing around all over the place, you probably, people have got 5 or 6 different windows open, start one thing, something else comes up, there's a little pop-up, they'll start working on that, and then something else comes up. And we're just interrupting ourselves all over the place. And kind of, if you think about your mental battery, you're starting the day, like how much of that battery is being worn down through that process. Whereas if you just focused on each of those items, you'd have so much more mental energy. And it's actually worse than that. So you can do this and you can learn to do this. And we do, right? Because we still manage to get our jobs done and to get through the day. But you're actually training yourself to work in that way. And it's degrading your ability to get that kind of focus that I was talking about. So that's one of the ways that our digital environment really erodes our capacity to kind of have that flow state and attentional capacity. So I see like mindful meditation as a way to repair some of that damage that we're doing to ourselves in the way that we're working.
Yeah, I like with the podcast episode and talking about the brain and an operating system and these parallels with like technology and what we're talking about. It feels like a parallel is almost like defragging, where you defrag your hard drive and it becomes much more efficient. Defragging your time so that you, instead of being really like bitty, you've got like chunks of consecutive time where you can just focus.
Absolutely.
And that feels like nice. Again, a metaphor similarly, I just don't know which one. I need to Google those and remind myself which one means what. So shall we talk about fundamentals, as in how do we keep ourselves more healthy so that we can enjoy life and do this kind of thing and be more focused and be happier? Absolutely.
So we sort of treat our bodies as taxis for our minds, right? That's kind of the way that society treats it. We've got this kind of the mind and body are different, but they're not. We're one interconnected system. And actually modern neuroscience is showing that a lot of like bodily sensation and body budgeting actually has a role in your thoughts and the quality of your thinking and the sort of the nature of your thoughts. So like if you're tired or hungry, that's actually going to shape the way that you think or your capacity to think. So, some of this is just basics, but nutrition, exercise and sleep are kind of fundamental. If you want to be able to get into that flow state, if you want to learn, if you want to work effectively, you cannot ignore those things. They really are foundational. And again, it's something that, if you were kind of thinking about how do I get better as a developer, people just don't look at those. They think of all the other stuff. But if you're burning the candle at both ends, if you don't have a regular sleep schedule, if you're not getting enough sleep for your body, then you're just leaving so much performance on the table. Like, sleep is where like knowledge consolidation happens. I mean, there's lots we don't understand about sleep, but the scientists think that is where kind of learning really happens, and you consolidate memories and what happened through the day. And if you're not giving the space for that, then you're not going to learn as effectively and you're going to be more forgetful. So, sleep is really foundational in terms of, ability to function well. And it's similar with nutrition. There's a lot of emerging evidence around, food that you take in, especially ultra-processed foods, can impact on structures in your brain. So there's a study where subjects were given a highly processed diet for 3 weeks, and they looked at memory tasks and a structure in the brain called the hippocampus, which is crucial to learning and memory. And they saw it shrink in that period, and they saw measurable reductions in cognitive performance on memory tasks. And the flip side, when they actually had the good diet, so the subjects went from the ultra-processed over and vice versa, so there was across each person, it was a control for themselves. They saw improvements in those structures and their capacity to do stuff. So there's just a really simple example of the quality of the food that you take into your body impacting on your brain. And it's kind of both scary and a good news story, because you can see, I mean, the hippocampus is a structure that can grow. It can shrink and it can grow. So you can change your behavior and actually, change the structure of your brain and its capacity in a measurable way in relatively short time.
Yeah, I do find this, as you say, quite scary as well, because I think I've got a very good diet, but then it's kind of, for example, my kids, I make sure they eat quite healthy as well. But then when they go out with their friends and stuff, and their friends quite often have got like big bags of sweets and things, and the amount of sugar and processed stuff that's in that. And I think it's quite common. Like, for example, even if you go to the one thing I find quite interesting is if from in the supermarket or something, I know this is nosy, but just looking at the person in front of me is what's in their basket while we're queuing up. And most of the time it's like big massive bottles of Coke, junk, like just lots of processed food. And I think that is more the norm in our society, which is a shame really, because as you say, if it does affect the brain heavily and depression and that kind of thing, I think positioning of things in supermarkets and marketing of these things makes it so desirable to just reach for those things and easy to reach for those things. I think, yeah, it's a shame that it is that way. Going back to what you were saying about sleep as well, I thought you were going to mention Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, which is, I read that ages ago, and that was, I don't think there's been a book that I've recommended more to people. As in, it goes into all the things you've spoken about, and it's, again, terrifying as well, because I think, I mentioned about my kids, I think back to when they were like babies and we were hardly getting any sleep. I think actually when I read the book, it was around that kind of time. So it was really the wrong time to be reading that book about all the damage by not sleeping and the benefits to sleeping properly. And then I was being woken up all throughout the night by, I think, my eldest at the time. But yeah, it's kind of, I'll make sure I put that in the show notes, but that's definitely a highly recommended book.
Well, and from that, just like how many processes sleep is important to. And like how many of us have that social jet lag where you're kind of not getting enough sleep for the week and then you try and cram it in at the weekend. And there's so much data to show that's really bad for you. And actually a consistent wake schedule just all of the time really helps sets your circadian rhythm. And that's just such a fundamental that if you want to be effective and kind of be able to perform in your job, then that is just a crucial thing to get sorted in life.
So I'm quite nervous about bringing up this next thing, because when you and I start talking about this thing, we can be talking for hours and hours. We're both quite, well, you definitely more so than me, are quite into coffee. And I'll never forget one time when I was round at yours and you made me a coffee, and then later you sent me a link to the exact profile of that particular coffee with all graphs showing pressures and everything. That was awesome. If I can find it, and if it's okay with you, I'll share that in the show notes.
Yeah, there's a platform called Visualizer which shows coffee data. Yeah, I'm sure we could get a link to one to put into the show notes.
I'm sure I've got a link somewhere to the one you sent me. So my exact coffee a few years back. But so like caffeine is in, I suppose while we're talking about sleep, an observation that I've had with my caffeine and sleep is that years and years ago, I used to not be a very good sleeper. It used to take me hours to get to sleep. And I did have a lot of coffee throughout the day. But I thought, well, okay, is it coffee? So I stopped at lunchtime and it made no difference. So I assumed it wasn't coffee and I was just a bad sleeper. Then after a while, I tried, okay, I'm just going to have one coffee first thing in the morning. And I get up about 6-ish. And that made a night and day difference. And I found that if I have 2 coffees early in the morning at that kind of time, that also affects my. I do have 2 at the moment, but I accept the fact that it'll take me a little bit longer to get to sleep because I like my coffee, and I can have decaf as well, like throughout the day. Mm-hmm. But if I have 1 versus 2 at 6 in the morning, I notice the difference at bedtime, and that is an insane amount of time for that caffeine to stay in my system. But then some people can have caffeine literally just before going to bed, and it's fine. So I think everyone's so different. But from a sleep point of view, I think if that sounds familiar, then maybe experiment with just having 1 in the morning. But I guess caffeine can probably also be used as a productivity tool as well, if you get the timing and you use it that way.
Mm-hmm. So it's exactly as you say, and it's the same with a lot of nutrition. Like, it's very individual. I think that's what scientists are discovering these days, that there are huge individual differences, and the length of time that different people take to kind of get caffeine through processed into their system does vary hugely, which is why you're going to have to experiment yourself, as you say, to kind of look at that. So I have 2, sometimes 3 coffees, but yeah, like you, I would never have it in the afternoon, and that seems to be okay for me. There's actually a lot of good stuff in coffee, and decaf coffee is getting better and better. So for me now, I really enjoy making coffee and drinking it, and a good decaf to me tastes really good, and I can kind of enjoy it without any of that worry. So a decaf coffee's got all of the polyphenols, those kind of chemicals in that are really good for your system, and there's actually surprisingly a good chunk of fiber in a coffee as well.
I never knew that.
It's practically a health drink, and you get all of those from the decaf without the caffeine. So I just use caffeine strategically, and I know for me what's too much. And I'm also into competitive sports, so I kind of use it in that. So I actually try not to have too much day to day, because then when I want it in sport, it'll work more effectively for me. But yeah, decaf is your friend. So you can get really good ones these days and taste just as good. And you get all of that kind of positive health benefits from it without the downsides of caffeine.
Did we mention at the start your competitive cycling?
We did not.
Because, yeah, that, like, talking about like focus and, yeah, I think, is it the World Masters Championships you've just won in France?
We won the team pursuit at World Masters Champs in Roubaix, France, yes. So I'm very pleased with that.
So that was insanely impressive.
Well, for me, sport is another area where all of this stuff plays out. And it's actually where some of my interest in some of these things comes from, because it's a really good crucible for kind of testing some of this out. And for the various disciplines I do, that was 4 minutes and 20 to sort of do that. But it's a very intense focus that you need. You're riding, for people who might remember it if you see it at the Olympics, where you've got teams of 4 and you have to ride very close to each other. So I've got to ride millimeters off a wheel in front of me and know what's going on, and like when I need to change and all sorts of stuff. So there is a lot of focus needed in that. So all of this stuff that I find really interesting from a work point of view is also interesting in terms of sport. I think doing any kind of exercise is really important. Again, exercise, there's evidence that shows that exercise boosts learning, and there's all sorts of good stuff with it. But I also think it's a great place to learn the association between effort and reward. And it's a great place to kind of experiment and learn with focus. Whether it's whatever activity you choose to kind of do, is actually kind of being present with it and having that focus and attention where you need it to be to kind of do it effectively.
Yeah, I think like in our industry, we spend so much time just sat there all day long, very sedentary. Just movement in general. We've spoken a lot about, like, 2 years ago. I don't know if I've mentioned on the show, but 2 years ago, my back went quite badly. It was a very old injury, but it went chronic. And I've got a crutch and a walking stick, which I was using at the time. I did have a cortisol injection, which kind of like alleviated it for a bit. But since then, I decided, at that point, they said it would last about 3 months, then come back. So from then, I went to the gym every day and I've been training, and I've done that ever since. And thankfully, what I've been doing strength-wise, and I've been doing lots of learning and studying on what exercise to do to help it. Thankfully, it's not reoccurred, and I'm probably fitter and stronger than I've ever been. And I'm actually glad my back went, because where before I went to the gym very on and off, it was like I'd get into the habit and get out of the habit, where now I've got that motivation. I never want to be like that again, where I've got a walking stick and I can barely walk. But yeah, it's kind of like there's lots of other benefits. Like even as we get older, it's like we've spoken before about resistance training, doing weights. And it's not just a strength or aesthetic thing. It's kind of your bone density increases, and there's a whole raft of other benefits. And it's so important. Well, any form of movement and exercise, given that we sit down all day long.
Yeah, that sitting all day is actually, depending on who you listen to, is kind of really surprisingly bad for your health. And I'm always encouraging people to take sort of periods of the day to get active. You can do it, like, if you do the Pomodoro technique or whatever, you can just do an exercise snack in there, but a 5-minute walk or just doing some sort of exercise to kind of get the body working can be really good for you.
Yeah, definitely. This is a topic that I've never really looked into, but I keep on hearing about it, especially more recently. I don't know whether you have it or not, but like we're talking about like food and supplements and stuff and caffeine. But there's also an area called nootropics. I don't know whether you have looked into this at all.
I've seen some stuff in sport. So there are some supplements that you can take which have substances in them that are supposed to enhance your performance. And I know there's some around cognitive function. One of the supplements that I take, people may have heard of, is creatine, which is good for sort of strength work. But there's also interesting stuff now in terms of actually that having an effect on the brain as well, because you store a lot of a good portion of that extra creatine in the brain. So that's interesting to me. But as an athlete, I am liable to be dope tested, and I want to be a clean athlete. And so I tend to be very careful about any sort of supplements that I take, just to avoid any kind of problems down the line.
Yeah, I think creatine is one that I take it too, and it's one of those ones which, if you read up on it, it's almost like a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
They've done so much research on it, and there's not really been, unless they have it an overloading phase, I think called, where if you want to quickly get into your system, then you basically take too much, and some people have had stomach issues, but you just don't need to, because you just take the normal amount. It's called a maintenance period, where you just start taking that and just take that forever, really. And as you say, it's obviously a sports supplement, but it's also got benefits for the brain as well, and they're finding cognitive improvements and stuff.
Yeah, there's no need for that impatient loading phase. You can just take 5 grams a day and wait a month, and it will build up in your system. But there's also the interesting stuff around different forms of exercise, and actually the neuroprotective aspect of it as well, which is super interesting. And a lot of actually like strength training is training your brain as well. So your brain's having to work really hard to recruit all of those muscle fibers during strength work. And yeah, there's interesting stuff coming out now that's suggesting that actually that's really helpful in avoiding things like neurodegenerative diseases. So yeah, something that we kind of think, of course exercise is something that you should do, but I'll put that to one side. If you actually look at all of the ways that this can benefit you and actually enhance your life and your health span and protect your brain and enhance your brain, then I just think that adds to the motivation to go and do those things.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that since I've started going literally every day and doing a lot of resistance training, lots of strength training, that I feel night and day difference than I did a couple of years ago, or even before my back went. But now I'm consistently training. I've got more energy. I just feel better. Yeah, as you know, I'm a big advocate for strength training. Another thing I thought would be quite good to talk about, which we've spoken about before, is how, and we've kind of touched on this slightly already, but how we frame things in our mind. Because you've done talks at .NET Oxford, we've both done public speaking, and like for me, I found that the difference between nervousness and excitement are very similar kind of emotions. And before doing a talk, if I'm feeling a bit nervous, then if I try and in my mind just almost do a mental switch and then reframe it, that I'm not nervous, I'm excited, that energy is excitement, then it's so similar that that's an easy switch to do. And it makes such a big difference to the talk, because I'm projecting excitement rather than nerves. And I personally find it quite fascinating trying to frame things differently. It's like, for example, if I've got a really annoying bug that I just can't find, do I get frustrated and think, okay, so this is really driving me nuts? Where it's actually quite easy to reframe it in my mind and say, I'm going to solve this problem. You're not going to beat me, and try and get excited about it. And then suddenly I find that not only am I enjoying it more, but I'm much more likely to solve the problem.
Spot on. And this is another sort of upgrade your operating system. It's a way that you can really do this. And it kind of comes out of sort of latest understanding about neuroscience and emotion, and quite how much of our reality is we construct. So we get this sense that, the world in our experience is very objective and it just is how it is. And it's our response to it that we can control. But actually, the neuroscience is showing that what the brain is doing is it's constructing a whole range of simulations about, the next moment. It's issuing a load of predictions about it. And those simulations and predictions are based on your previous experience largely, actually way more than the information coming in from the external world. And then it's just looking at prediction error, like which of those has got least prediction error. And then that becomes your experience. And that's kind of mind-blowing in that we think we're experiencing a very objective reality, but what we're experiencing most of the time is our brain's best guess about what's going on. And so you can kind of realize that actually that construction, like you say, I'm getting these, it's called interoception. I'm getting these sensations in my body. And actually what your brain is doing is it's based on its previous experience and what it knows. It's constructing that emotional response. But what you can actually do is exactly what you say. You can actually, through a reframe, you can construct a different emotion. So you're taking the same information coming in and you're shaping it in a way that's actually more adaptive for your needs. And I think it's one of the things I love in coaching is kind of working people to do those reframes and then understanding quite how big an impact that can have on the nature of your experience. So, one way to think about it, it's all a story that your brain's sort of telling yourself to make sense of the situation. And if it is just a story, you can write a better story.
Yeah, I mentioned this to you before, but one conversation with my eldest son that always sticks in my mind was we went for a walk and I was talking to him about basically what we're talking about, positive thinking and things. And one tip I said to him was, if you take something where the sentence might be, I have to do something, I have to go to school, I have to whatever, changing it to I get to. And I was actually surprised by how he really got into that conversation. And he was got really excited and was thinking about all the different sentences he could put it to and was changing them. And it was such a positive conversation. And he really, and just that simple one word reframe. The bug thing I mentioned before, I have to solve this bug or I get to solve this bug. I can do a bit of problem solving. I enjoy programming and problem solving, so I get to do that. Another one is adding, if you can't do something, rather than saying I can't do it yet, adding the word yet at the end of the sentence, and just lots of little mind games almost like that.
Mm-hmm. And this is one of the areas where developing mindfulness skills can really help you with that, because what it trains you to do is to notice those thoughts, those storylines that your brain's telling you, and just look at them a bit more objectively and then sort of question them, rather than what we tend to do, which is kind of get sucked into them and treat them as objective reality. And it just is what it is. Actually just creating that little bit of distance so that then you can kind of look at them and change it. And if you think about what actually goes wrong for people in terms of things like flow state and being productive at work, it quite often is that negative self-talk. There's frustration comes in, I get angry with it, I'm kind of get agitated. And then if you're trying to, that's not a great recipe for getting into flow state and kind of really getting into something. And actually you're getting in your own way. And then you're off in that default mode network of rumination and why can't I do this? And then you're going to try and force yourself. You can't force this stuff to happen. You've just got to let it happen. And it becomes that vicious circle. Whereas actually, if you look at all of this stuff that I'm talking about, actually it really helps you to develop that more virtuous circle so that you can climb out of it and actually get into being more effective more of the time. There's so many developers I've worked with where the real blocker to their productivity is rumination and self-critical thinking. And it's sort of letting that stuff kind of rule the roost and feeding it, and then that constantly getting in the way. Whereas if you can kind of work to let that go, you kind of create the space that then you can kind of then get on with the job and just focus much more easily.
I wish I'd known this when I was doing the Azure B2C custom policies work. There was lots of that. But luckily moving on. So we are quickly running out of time. So shall we do dev tips?
Okie dokie. Well, here's one that's just, it might sound a little bit woo-woo, but give it a go. So I'm a great fan of making sure that you're writing code that's readable. And I think one part of that is trying to get yourself into the perspective of others looking at your code rather than on the inside looking out. So just try this. You've done the piece of work. You're ready to do the PR. Go have a break, but actually then come back to it in a different location. So a different perceptual position can actually be really useful to adopt a different mindset to something. So my tip is, when you're looking at your code to do that final review of it, and you're trying to do it from the point of view of somebody else on the team, do it somewhere else. Do it in a different seat or a different location, and see if that allows you to see things from a slightly different perspective. Because, when you've done it, you're so in the moment and in your way of seeing things, it can be quite hard to sort of see things from an external perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm kind of thinking different ways you could do that. I guess even moving the browser window that you're looking at the PR into a different monitor, I guess, that you would normally do or something.
You could do it like that. So you just move your chair around, just do something different with your body and kind of look at a different monitor. And then you can kind of build that association with that kind of like persona review, which is slightly different. But if you can grab a laptop and go and sit somewhere else and have like a chair where you're doing your PR kind of review chair or something like that, then that also works. It's just giving yourself a slightly different environment, which then helps the brain to see things from a different angle.
I would say even with that, it's kind of like, even if you don't do what you just said then, just the act of actually reviewing your own PR, because lots of people would probably quit the branch, push it, and then they've quitted the PR, pass it over. But actually, once you've created the PR, go and look at it and look at all the changes. So many people just forget to do that or don't bother doing that step. And there's really obvious things in there, which actually, if you just put on that reviewer role just for 5 minutes and look through the changes you've made before passing it over to someone else, that you would catch them. So yeah, definitely. So my dev tip is, well, we've spoken about like the Pomodoro timer and that kind of thing. Something out like, so I don't really have one technique like Pomodoro where I stick to all the time, because I find by just changing them, I find I get bored of one and then I move to something else, and different techniques working depending on what mood I'm in. But one technique I quite like is still sticking with the timer, but rather than having 25 minutes, if I've got like a very small granular task, look at it and think, well, okay, so I reckon I can do that in 5 minutes. Set a timer for 5 minutes. That's my goal, 5 minutes. Or if there's something else that I think I can do in 10 minutes, then set a time for 10 minutes. And that means I've got a very short goal. And I'm not talking about an entire user story. I'm just talking about one granular thing. I've got a kitchen, well, the listeners can't see it, but I can put it up to the webcam for Rob. Just a kitchen timer where I can just switch it over, like turn the dial. If I think something's going to take 5 minutes, do that. And then it's like, that's a challenge. I'm going to do this thing in 5 minutes. And if you, throughout the day, if you're doing that, then it just makes a huge difference to staying focused, because I've got these very short windows of time to get that thing done. So I can't get distracted by emails or Twitter or whatever it is, because I've only got 5 minutes to do this thing I've just challenged myself to do. So I think that's quite a useful thing I do sometimes as well. As I say, I've got a few different techniques like that, where Pomodoro or that, which I kind of cycle between, because if I just do the same all the time, it stops working. But having a different tools in the toolbox, that works quite well.
Yeah, I'm going to do that thing now where that's called the goal gradient effect. Like when you start a goal, you've got that kind of initial period of enthusiasm and you're motivated, and when you can see the end in sight, again, your brain picks up steam. But there's that kind of doldrums in the middle. So one way to get over that is to make the goal period quite short, as you've done there, to divide a big thing up into small things, and then you've always kind of got a really short kind of doldrums in the middle, and you can rely on that goal gradient effect of the beginning and the end to kind of see you through.
For context for the listeners, when Rob said he's going to do that thing, so this is quite common in our conversations. I'll make an observation about something that I don't really understand why. It worked for me, and then Rob will explain all the sciences and the words I can't pronounce. I do enjoy our conversation, so that's why I've really been looking forward to actually making a podcast out of it. Was there anything that we've not covered that you did want to bring up?
No, hopefully that'll be enough to get the listeners interested and a little bit curious about upgrading their brain's operating system.
Oh, I'm sure it is. For the listeners that do want to reach out to you, you've obviously got Double Loop Coaching, which we'll include those in the show notes.
That's right, yeah. Doubleloopcoaching.com. People can find me there.
Cool. And I'll include a link to all of those in the show notes and all the things we've mentioned today. So with that, just a massive thank you for joining us. As I say, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, and I think we've put it off a few times, but we've got there in the end.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter, X, @Drakan. But the best place to get in touch with me is on Discord, and on the website you can find, as well as show note links to all the things we've spoken about today, the link to the Discord channel, which is on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.